for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding today's markup. For more than 15 months, with the exception of a brief period of time this summer, the FEC has not had enough commissioners to do its job. And today we do take an important step toward restoring a quorum and getting the FEC back on track in terms of filling out the commissioner jobs. Well, that starts with, of course, confirming Shauna Broussard. She is eminently qualified and would be the first person of color on the FEC in the history of the FEC. I'm so pleased that she, I believe, is going to get through this committee. I have expressed strongly my concerns about the Republican nominees. We know that Mr. Dickerson has made a career of advocating for less, not more, transparency in political spending. And in the future, I hope this committee will work together to advance nominees as we have in the past, one-on-one. The second item, I agree with the chairman here very strongly. This is a big day, that our agenda includes two very important pieces of legislation, which would establish the American Women's History Museum and the National Museum of the American Latino within the Smithsonian. I'm proud to co-sponsor these bills, proud of the efforts of Senator Collins and Senator Feinstein, as well as Senator Menendez and Senator Cornyn in leading these bills. And it's important to keep in mind as we come to the end of the year that Democrats and Republicans have come together to support both pieces of legislation. I believe these museums are critical to expanding our understanding of the remarkable contributions that women and Latinos have made throughout our nation's history. And one day when we walk in those museums, we will remember this moment when we got this through the committee in December. Mr. Chairman, since this is our final Rules Committee gathering for the 116th Congress, I wanted to thank you for your really good work, including in your work in leading our inaugural committee. And I also want to acknowledge the departing members of the Rules Committee, Senator Roberts, Senator Alexander, and Senator Udall. Your service over the years have meant so much to this committee, and so have the contributions that each of you have made, and with the special recognition of the work that Senator Udall has done when it comes to elections and trying to keep our democracy safe and strong going well into the future, that will last his service on this committee, and we look forward to what you're doing next. Thank you.
Consider the nominations of Alan Dickerson, Sean J. Cooksey, and Shauna M. Bouchard to be members of the Federal Election Commission. The question is on the nomination of Alan Dickerson. Is there any discussion? The question is on ordering the nomination favorably reported. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The nomination of Alan Dickerson is favorably reported.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, I'd like to be recorded as a no, to make it clear.
Clerk will record for the three senators have asked to be recorded as a no: Senator Klobuchar, Senator Udall, and
Senator Cortez Masto.
Senator Cortez Masto. The next question. The question is on ordering the nomination favorably reported. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The nomination of Sean J. Cooksley is favorably reported.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to be recorded as a no, and I'd also like to ask for unanimous consent to submit a statement on the record explaining why for both of the two nominees we just voted on.
Without objections. Our official work is done. Before I adjourn the committee, or anyone want to have any comment to make today on the work we've done?
It's a very well-behaved committee, Mr. Chairman.
Very well done. Thank you for helping us get this work done.
Good work.
Committee's adjourned.
Thank you.
Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Coons, no.
I think where I'm at. Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? On this vote, the yeas are 48, the nays are 47, and the nomination is confirmed. The Senate will be in order. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's actions.
Madam President,
The Majority Whip.
I ask unanimous consent that the mandatory quorum call be waived.
Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Liam P. Hardy of Virginia to be a judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, signed by 17 senators.
Unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Liam P. Hardy of Virginia to be judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Aye. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin.
That's a problem for many of us.
Mr. Enzi. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mrs. Loeffler. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow,
Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Jones, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Ms. Hirono, no.